Hey y'all, how's it going? Rich with Burn Social here, and I clogged my printer just to make this video for you. Today, the topic we're going to cover is just how to unclog your hot end. It's a pain in the butt to disassemble your hot end enclosure, so we're going to break this into a couple different parts. The first step is we're going to be able to tell if the extruder is most likely clogged before we take it all apart. I'm going to show you my easy peasy method for getting it unclogged, and then after that, I'm going to show you a couple ways you can help prevent a clog in the future. So here are the timestamps for each of these things, so you'll be able to skip the part that's maybe more relative to you. So with that, let's get right into the video. One of the easiest ways to tell if your extruder is clogged is if there's nothing coming out of the hot end. It can be partially clogged, so maybe you'll have a little bit less filament coming out than normal. Your prints may look like this. That would just be directly labeled under extrusion. I have a video right here for a couple tips and tricks of how to fix that. It'll cover some different points and methods in this video so I definitely recommend you checking that out. So to get into this, one of the easiest ways to tell if your extruder is clogged is if there's nothing coming out of the hot end. So you can see that you have your filament rigged up correctly. Any filament runout sensor you have isn't triggered. The extruder gear is moving filament as it turns. It's not scraping anything out. If that's the issue, then again, refer to this under extrusion video I have. If this is the case, heat up your nozzle to about 10 to 15 degrees Celsius lower than you typically print at, and then slowly pull your filament out. Make sure you don't hear anything snap. If the end of your filament looks like this, with a big glob at the end, it's pretty safe to say that you're dealing with a clog. It might actually even be tough to pull out, and if the end of it is squared off like this, you know that you're pulling out of like a very large deposit down at the end of the tube. That's clogging up the end of your bone tube. If you can raise your nozzle about 20 millimeters off the bed, heat up to around the temperature that you know you can comfortably extrude your filament at, and then manually push some through or manually extrude any of that filament and nothing's really coming out, it's safe to assume you have a clog. So the only way we're going to clean this out is by taking apart the hot end enclosure. Super quick to do. Like I said at the beginning, I have a very easy way of fixing this. I've unclogged my hot end hundreds of times. The reason being because I'm too lazy to manually level my bed every time I use it. Alright, so now to get into the fix, I'm going to show you guys how to do this. My CR10 S5 printer sitting behind me. I chose this because the hot end enclosure is going to be very similar to any type of hobbyist or consumer grade printer you'll find out there. It's very bare bones, so it should be easy to work with. You're only going to need two tools to get this done. So one being an adjustable wrench to get the nozzle and bone tube out after you've heated up, and then one being some sort of material to be able to push filament out. I like to use an Allen key. It's the size I usually use to fix the printer anyway. I don't really recommend doing this with a tool you use a lot, as there's a chance for the plastic to gunk up on the end.
5 hours later.
So after heating, I like to usually take the bone tube out. It should be as easy as pressing down on this plastic ring, and the bone tube should slide out. But as you can see from some of the marks and the rings around here, this kind of cheap hardware doesn't really like to cooperate all the time, especially after it's had some use and it's come back and forth. I already like the length of it, and I've already tested this ring, and it's already jammed. Instead, what I'll do, I'll use the adjustable wrench, grab in, unscrew it. So after a couple turns, you'll be able to tighten it, you'll be able to loosen it by hand. Spinning it like this will actually create some of these cuts into the bone tube, locking it further in place. So if you're able to get it out with the plastic ring, I don't advise going to this step. So once you're loose enough, you'll be able to wiggle around freely. As long as your hot end is heated up, even if it's clogged, you should be able to, with a little bit of effort, pop out. As you can see from the end of mine, if I got it focused correctly, is that there's a little bit of residue along the outside of it. Either the tube wasn't cut flush, or it wasn't pushed down all the way, or both. That created a gap for the filament to flow into. With the bone tube out, you're now going to want to raise your hot end just a little bit. I have mine 40 millimeters up. And we're going to use the adjustable wrench again to screw out the nozzle. Be extremely careful, because this will burn if you touch it. So what we really don't want to see is any filament squished in to the threads of where this nozzle goes into. That means that your nozzle is not in tight enough, which is definitely, and that is going to make it very difficult to replace the nozzle or to clean out. What I'll do in that instance is typically just I have to heat up the hot end each time I want to screw the nozzle in. And then you're going to have this happen a lot more easily. Especially as it gets very loose, be careful, it's going to want to wiggle and fall out on you. Alright, so you can see it just drops out like that. Again, you're not going to want to touch this with your hand. So with the nozzle, while it's still hot, you're going to want to inspect the end to see if you see any blobs of plastic sticking out. Luckily in this case we don't have any. If there were a blob, maybe a little bit of stringing sticking out, what you would do, you would take it quickly while it's still hot, because it's going to be tough to heat back up. Pinch the end and pull it out. It'll cut. As long as you go slowly enough, it'll come out like a big piece of Play-Doh. It'll just keep stretching until eventually you see the nub at the end. I'll at least include some pictures of what that looks like, so we weren't able to capture it this time. Another test you can do is to look straight down the nozzle, see if you can see light at the other side. I can't, which means there's a little bit of filament stuck in there. What you can do in that case is also, while it's still hot, you take one of these needles. These little needles, they like to include your print kit. If not, you can take a normal needle, stick it down the end, push, wiggle it around. So you stick it in, push it around. If we can get a little bit of filament to come through, I just see a little bit there at the tip, and then hopefully you're good to go. These don't typically work for me. So what I find is when I push it down, it actually just squishes the plastic in there. Maybe it's just not sharp enough, or maybe an actual needle from your house will work better. Or you might want to have some spare nozzles on hand. You can get them for pretty cheap. I could put a link down below to some nozzles I use. You should replace your nozzle as soon as you start to notice your tolerance is changing a little bit too much for your comfort level. But I change mine extremely regularly, especially based off clogs. So now that we've cleared out our nozzle, or decided that we need a new one, what we're going to do is we're just going to carefully put it off to the side. Remember, it still could be hot, so we're going to give it a couple extra minutes. Now coming up above the hot end, we're going to look straight down, see what we see through it. See a little bit of residue along the inside, but nothing terrible. What I like to do is I'll take my Allen key from earlier, maybe just a couple millimeters big, large enough to fit in this hole. And just take a couple clearing pushes. So make sure you give attention to each of the edges while you have this open. Just go all the way around, up and down. So we pull it out, and I actually do see a decent amount of white filament around the edges, which means so there was some unwanted residue in there. And this is the kind of stuff that if you don't handle early enough, so it'll do what we mentioned before, and it'll squish down into the threads around the nozzle and then out, or it can feed back into your bone tube and create enough of a clog that you'll actually need to clip the end of it. You'll quickly be able to see if there is a clog down the stretch of the bone tube. If there is, easiest thing to do, as long as you have some extra wiggle room, is just clip the first 1/2 inch to 1 inch. Push this hardware component up a little bit, it should catch again, and then you'll be able to go. You'll be good to go. If not, you'll need to get a replacement bone tube. If you're already replacing it, might as well get some Capricorn Tube. That's what I use, this blue color, and I can leave a link to that in the description below. All that's left to do is put the hot end enclosure back together, see what comes out. You're going to want to leave the hot end heated up to that 10 to 15 degrees Celsius less than you typically print at. When I put mine back together, I like to put the nozzle in first. Make sure that there's no filament squeezing out between the threads. And then I'll take the bone tube, take a super small amount off, like a millimeter, just to give it a fresh end. Make sure it's flat. Make sure it's perfectly perpendicular to the end of the tube, so that when it goes down, it makes a nice solid connection to the, so when it goes down, it makes a nice solid connection to the nozzle. There's no gap in there for filament to feed into. And then also make sure that you have enough room on your bone tube for it to be able to reach the other side of the printer where it needs to get to. If your bone tube is pulled too tight or too tight of an angle, what can happen is that there's a lot of friction in the bone tube. That friction will either slow the path of the filament or not allow the extruder gear to push it down. Then what happens, you'll get under extrusion in your prints. Worst case scenario, the extruder gear doesn't catch, and if it's not catching, nothing's moving, but the hot end, or the heating element, is still at that printing temperature, so you'll get filament that just kind of clumps up into a glob, and then you'll be back where you started with yet another clog. So always good to check when you're at that point. Stick around, because what we're going to do is we're going to cover a couple of reasons why this happens, how to avoid it in the future so that you're doing this as little as possible. Hopefully, maybe you bookmark this video, but hopefully it's not one you have to come back to very often at all if you follow the steps that we're about to go through. Now, I'll help share a couple of things that I've run into that can help minimize the amount of times that your extruder gets clogged. First and foremost will be bed leveling. It's like more important than anything. If your nozzle is too close to the bed, you're gonna have too much pressure build up inside that nozzle. It can't force out all the material it needs, and then it starts to back up higher and higher up your nozzle. A tip for that would be to level between every print. I am one of the worst culprits for this. I don't level my printers as often as I should, nowhere close to it. I do a lot of like manual leveling, but you should be using something like the postcard method. If you don't have an auto leveler, it's exceptionally helpful. But even with an auto leveler, if the device you're using is inconsistent, or if you have your initial layer height offset too close to the bed, you'll end up with the same issue, and it doesn't have to happen immediately. This can be a small buildup over time. If you're just a little bit too squished, that little reservoir of filament can build up over time until finally it creates enough back pressure that nothing can come out of the hot end anymore. You'll be able to tell if this is starting to happen if you pull out your filament and it starts to look like this, but it hasn't clogged yet. If you're changing your filament or constantly clipping the ends of your filament, not doing enormous prints, it's not a huge issue, but it's definitely worth getting right so you can avoid this issue altogether. So another reason this could be happening is because you have insufficient fan cooling. So the fan that blows directly onto the heatsink above your heating element is what cools the filament. Just an isolated amount of filament at the end to be hot as it gets extruded out. If your fan isn't on high enough, it's broken, or your ambient temperature is a little bit too high, what'll start to happen is that the filament will get hotter, higher and higher up, and then begin to compact or begin to compress rather than just compressing locally at the point of the nozzle where it's going out. This will create too big of an object to push through your nozzle. If your bone tube isn't pushed all the way down touching your nozzle, then this heated filament will be able to fill in those cracks and really give you a yucky situation to fix. The exact same thing can happen if you have too high of a retraction on your filament. So some filaments do require a higher retraction. You really have to play with it to get it dialed into what your printer needs. You'll be stretching the filament out, which then when it compresses down again will create a little blob that just forces back pressure and then compounds until you can no longer get filament out of the nozzle. Your nozzle can also clog if your hot end temperatures are too low. The filament won't be melting correctly. Same thing, bulging as it compresses this like semi-heated material until once again too much of a blockage to allow any more filament to pass through. There's some easy ways to tell based off your first layer that goes down and also your final product if you get a full printout if your temperatures are too low. I'm going to have a link down below in the description to a Simplify 3D article that'll help you diagnose if your temperatures are too hot or too cold. You'll be able to tell in the first layer of the print as well as in the final product as long as you get a part all the way out. That's the whole video. Thank you for watching. Appreciate you tuning in. Hopefully your issue is fixed. And if you know of any easier ways to diagnose, fix, or prevent this problem, drop a comment below. I'd love to see it. You'll be able to hopefully help somebody else watching this video. If this video helped you, drop a big like. Majorly appreciated. You can subscribe for more updates. Definitely turn on those notifications. We don't post very often, but I have a whole backlog of fun ideas to be able to make videos about that I'd love to share with you. And also feel free to shoot us a message on any of our socials, letting us know how we're doing. If there's any fun facts you want to share about 3D printing, share your experience. We're happy to feature it here if you do have any. Or if you have any comments or questions, topics you'd like us to cover, etc. But yeah, thanks for tuning in, guys. Happy printing.